Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Amulo. By God's grace, I serve as the Director of the Navigators Kenya. It's a joy to have many of you. I'm sure if we had held this conference physically, we would not have 147 of you already who have joined. And I want to appreciate the planning team led by Victor, Ndenya, Jesse, and their team. I want to welcome especially those of you who this is your first time to attend a Navigator meeting. Just to let you know that the Navigators is a worldwide partnership of a people committed to advance the gospel of Jesus and his kingdom into the nations through spiritual generations of laborers living and discipling among the lost. The Navigators are committed to know Christ and to make him known. We minister in over 100 countries. In Kenya, the Ministry of the Navigators has been present since 1956, and we've worked in various institutions, high schools, colleges, churches, universities, and in homes and in marketplaces. It's a joy to have an opportunity to meet people like you, and a joy to have my friend, Dr. Jerry White, just sharing with us. Dr. Jerry White has served in various capacities within the Navigators, serving as international president for over 2 decades. Now he's international president emeritus, and he served also as the chair of the US Navigators Board. He is a friendly guy who has demonstrated working and serving God through the seasons of life. He's been able to serve as a frontline Christian worker. He's worked in academia, and he has worked in the military. He served as an associate professor of the astronautics at the US Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs in the US space program. He served in the Air Force for 37 years, where he worked both as in active duty and in reserve, and he retired as a Major General. Jerry is the treasurer and board member of the Luzerne movement and has helped lead in developing of the Global Workplace Forum. Jerry and his wife Mary have written 16 books. They live in Colorado Springs. They have 4 grown children and 11 grandchildren. So it's a joy to have Jerry. He's one gentleman that in the few occasions I get to go to the United States, Jerry usually takes me out for a meal, and it's just a joy to serve with him. So, Brother Jerry, take on from here. Welcome to Kenya. Welcome to Rwanda. Wherever people are listening to, you are welcome in those countries. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. I think this is always an experiment. This is like flying an airplane for the first time. And especially an airplane you've never flown before. You get in and you wonder what buttons to push and where to go. It's really great to be with you. Today, I'm able to share one of the key ideas that has driven me for decades. If you notice the extensive secular background that I have, I felt God called me into the middle of that background, and we'll talk about that extensively over the next couple days. Today, we're going to focus primarily on the topic of why work. And there has to be some reason for it. And then tomorrow we'll talk about calling. It's interesting, this morning before we came online here, I was reading in the Psalms, and in Psalm 32 it says, You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you. But then it has this little interesting verse. It says, don't be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. And so we want to be people who are voluntarily following God. We're people who obey him wherever he leads us. And for 99% of the people in the world, that is going to be in the world of work. Now, I think there are two dates that almost everyone will remember. Some may not remember 9/11 in 9/11, September 11, 2001, but anybody over a certain age will certainly have that date etched in their minds. But the spring of 2020 will be etched in everybody's memory for years to come. But you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has created more economic chaos than 9/11 did. It affects us all, but especially it's affected how we work or if we work. Let me give you a scenario. Suppose one day you came into work and are greeted by your boss, and that boss says to you, I'm sorry, but this is your last day. We just don't have a job for you now. And then he or she goes on to say that we're downsizing, we're adjusting to COVID, or we're right sizing. Whatever you call it, you no longer have work. So panic and anxiety and anger are all mixed in with your new reality. In England, they call it being made redundant. I don't know whether that's something you use, a term you use in Kenya or in any parts of Africa. It may be a softer term, but it's got the same effect. No job, no income. In addition to that, all of us struggle to some degree in our jobs. And when we have work, we often ask, is this really important? Is this all there is to life? Then when you no longer have a job, you realize how key it is or was to your survival and to your ego and to your self-image. You know, I can't help but reflect that this COVID-induced work from home is possible. I've been doing it for months now, but only for a few of us. For many throughout the world, restaurant workers, retail stores, transportation industry, there is no such thing as working from home. You just simply do no longer have a job. And in Kenya, I'm sure many of you have jobs where the computer may not be a part of it. And in many, many countries that are underdeveloped, there is no safety net. There is no unemployment benefit. There is no government check. And for many, sadly, there is no food. We're seeing problems with children who are hungry throughout the world. We're seeing child abuse at a level we never have before. All of this because there is no work. There was one worker in India in the transportation industry when everything closed down, had to walk home. But walking home was 200 miles. So even when we have a job, it's not always fulfilling or easy. And I'd just like to describe a little of my own family background. Many of you may know, if you've heard me speak before, know that I come from a very small farm community in the middle of the United States. And in fact, the village was just 100 people, and now it's 82 people. And I still go back there with my cousins. And their sad thing happened for my mother. She was divorced when I was less than a year old. And so I grew up in that small community, being raised by my grandfather and my mother. Then my mother remarried when I was about 8 years old. And at 9 years old, we moved from that comfortable little Norwegian farm community to the state of Washington, 1,500 kilometers away, out on the west coast of the United States, to a city of 180,000. And I was one shook up, anxious kid. Here I had a brand new stepfather who I did not really know, and he really didn't know me. And so we were launching on a new life, but it was a hard life for me, left me with many, many anxieties. So I'd like to describe my stepfather. He was a gentle, wonderful man. He was a truck driver in the city, carrying and delivering freight all over the city. He was a hard worker, and never once did I hear him complain. He just went and did his job to provide for us. When I was 13, I met my actual father for the first time, and later on got to know him much better because he lived in Colorado and we came to live in Colorado with the Navigators and with the Air Force. He was a mechanic, and he was appalled at my lack of skill with auto repairs or anything mechanical. My grandfather, who raised me, did custom threshing for farm crops. He painted houses and barns. He butchered animals for the farmers. He was a laboring man in an Iowa farm community. My guess is that many of you who are on this call and this conference is that you grew up in a rural area and your parents were laboring people, working people, perhaps with little education, just like was the situation with me. So our topic today is going to be why work. Here is a picture of a gentleman in Spokane, Washington, a businessman. On the left is Bob Shepler. I'm the young man in the dark coat in the middle. We're kind of playing at pushing this log. It was up on a mountain. Bob had taken us out there for an outing, just to have some fun. Bob was a businessman, and it was through Bob that I came to know Jesus as my personal Savior. Now, back in my little church community in Iowa, I'm sure I had heard the gospel, but I didn't understand it. But Bob taught us Sunday after Sunday in our Sunday school class, and then he would spend time with us during the week. And so I came to Christ through the ministry of an ordinary businessman. And my first picture of a committed follower of Jesus Christ was a businessman. He was tough, he was demanding. I worked for him in his business. He taught me how to think, and he taught me how to be committed to Christ. And believe me, that shaped my view of Christianity. And by the way, let me just interrupt myself. I'm not going to speak for this entire hour and 10 minutes. And as Victor and I talked, if you would be jotting down notes, putting them into the chat boxes, and Chris or someone will use those as a basis for a question and answer time before we go to our breakout groups. So I would like to ask you this question. What shaped you? Think back on the first 15 years of your life. What was it like? What were your parents like? Were you raised by your grandparents like I was? Were you raised in a big home with many, many siblings? Were you raised in the rural area? Did your family require that you work in the fields or in some business? And then I would say, well, that forms who you are. Now, when I think of survival, I put up here survival mandates. What does it take to survive? And the first thing, you have to eat. Without food, you die. And our hearts are torn by the famines that have ensued all over the world especially during COVID, especially in the refugee camps. The second thing we need to sleep. If you don't sleep, you become disoriented and ill. And thirdly, you need to work to meet the needs of your family, to make money, whether it's building software or selling insurance or working in a shop or being an architect. It's necessary for us to live, and everybody works. And for most people, it's not just 40 hours a week. For many people, it's 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And finally, we need to relate. That is, we need relationships. Without the relationships of family and of community, we become like orphans, no place to call home. And there's a relief to going back to where you first grew up. It's kind of like you walk back into home. And for those of you who are married and have children, when those children come home, it's where they feel safe. It's where they're with you. And so they need a place to call home. But if we did not have work, what would happen? Well, we lose motivation. We lose our dignity. We lose our identity. And we lose our ability to meet our family needs. Now, I wish I could see all of you, but we'll have this little exercise. If you are married and have children, how many of you teach your children to work? In other words, do you give them chores, help them clean the house, take care of things outside? Perhaps you have some chickens or some animals. Doing dishes. I know of no parent that doesn't have their children do it. You know, when I was growing up, I had certain chores that I had to do. When our kids were growing up, they had to do certain things around the house. And for that, we gave them some kind of an allowance. And it's one of the oldest and most fundamental ideas that we teach our children, and that is to work. Many of you know the name Dr. Albert Schweitzer. He was a brilliant man, a scientist, a medical doctor, and he was one of the very, very earliest missionaries to the continent of Africa. He had doctorates in science, medicine, music, theology, and philosophy, many honorary degrees from leading universities around the world. And he ministered in what we call Gabon today. And he was working at a hospital site, and it was an expansion project for heavy, tiring manual labor. And he was out there digging away. And he saw a man from the country reading a book. And Schweitzer asked him to come help with the work. And offended at the suggestion because the man was educated, he says, "Oh, since I'd become an intellectual, I no longer do manual labor." And the brilliant Dr. Schweitzer said, "Well, I used to be an intellectual, but I didn't make it." Whereupon Schweitzer picked up some heavy timbers and went on to do some work. And you see, everybody has to work. And the kind of work we have is not the important thing, but that we work. I love a quote by Dr. Albert Schweitzer. He says, "The tragedy of life is not that we die, but what dies inside a man while he lives." Something has to work in us to give us motivation to get up in the morning, to go do something, to be engaged and to be involved. No one wants to just sit around the house. So I would ask the question, do we work to live, or do we live to work? So does work actually have a meaning? And as a believer, does it have more or less meaning? And someone could kind of sarcastically say, well, it's all going to burn, so let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, That, of course, is a quote from Scripture. We know that. Most of us work to live. That is, we're happy just to have a job. There are a few people in the world who are workaholics and who, for some reason, just get such incredible pleasure out of their work that they neglect their family. But most of us work hard at what we do. I'd like to turn to what the Scripture says. And I'd like you to read along with me here. I'd read it out loud with you if we were in the same room together, which I had hoped we would be doing for this conference. So let's read 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 13. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teaching you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we did not have the right to such a help, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. We hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. And as for you, brothers and sisters, never tire of doing what is God, what is good. Now, here is Paul, the great apostle of the New Testament, the super apostle, the theologian of grace and justification, now addressing the mundane: work, eating, interaction with each other. So this is a summary of Paul's teaching in this letter to the Thessalonians. Don't be idle or lazy. He says, I did it as an example. And then he says, no work, no eat. Now that is tough stuff. Now let's recognize there are people who can't work. There are people who don't have work. There are people who are infirm. And we have mechanisms within our church to be able to help them. So this is not a commentary on social events or how you treat people who are elderly or widows or whatever it may be. There are people who we serve, for instance, in refugee camps where there is no work. So this is meant for the ordinary person that he was addressing in Thessalonica. If you don't want to work, then you shouldn't eat. And the third thing was to settle down, work, eat, and do good. Now, what is the context of this? And so let me give you a little bit of history here. Thessalonica was the capital of first century Macedonia. It's now called Salonika. Paul, Silas, and Timothy visited this town on their second missionary journey. Paul preached in their synagogue, and get this, for only 3 Sabbaths. So he establishes a church in 3 weeks. Then the Jewish community attacked the home of Paul's host, Jason, claiming that he had lodged those who, according to Acts 17, quote, have turned the world upside down, and that they had broken Caesar's laws in declaring that Jesus to be another king. So Paul and Silas had to leave the city, probably to protect peace. Some converts were from higher class families, but most were from lower class working families. Now later, Paul sent Timothy back to Thessalonica and may well have visited once again himself. It was an infant church with immature believers. So Paul decided, I'm not going to let them say anything bad about me. I am not going to take any support from them. As new converts from paganism, they were persecuted. And apparently, there was also some conflict over idleness and the necessity of work, possibly with the teaching that had come from various places that Christ was going to return immediately. And it builds on the earlier instruction in his first letter of 1 Thessalonians. And in that first letter, here is what he said: make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Isn't that a great verse? One of the first ones I memorized when I was thinking of this area of work. We ought to have a quiet life, mind our own business, work with our hands, so that you may win the respect of outsiders. And then later in 1 Thessalonians 5, he says, we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. So the teaching here is one reason for work is to win the respect of outsiders and not to be dependent on anyone. Now, my question is, where did Paul get those ideas? Well, he got it from his extensive study of the Old Testament as a Pharisee and the practical teaching of his ancestors. After all, a Pharisee was not a full-time Christian worker. A Pharisee was somebody who had his own profession, but he was still highly trained in the law and the prophets. And if you go through the Old Testament again and again and again, you're going to find passages on work. So he got it from his training as a Pharisee, and then he applies this to the way that people have to live with a religion that has no social roots in the society. It's brand new. This is now Christianity. And you go back to Genesis 1:27 and 28. This is where Paul got it. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Some people call this the creation mandate. The creation mandate. And I don't think I put this down. I didn't put it in the slides here. And that means that God gave us the world we are in to take care of it. In fact, in Genesis 2, now get this, this is before sin entered into the world. And it says in Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the man, put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So the first thing that God gave man to do was to work. I often say that the Garden of Eden wasn't a Disneyland or an amusement park. It wasn't a place where you laid around in a hammock and ate bananas, but it was a place of work. The second great command in Genesis 2, again, before sin entered the world, was on marriage. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined together as one flesh. Now, throughout the Old Testament, there was the honoring of men and women of skill and talent in every area of work, art, and life. Just look at the tabernacle and the temple. Proverbs 22:29 says, do you see a man skilled in his work? He shall stand before kings. he shall not stand before average men. So now the question, why work? It's pretty simple. First of all, I want to emphasize that if there's nothing else you get out of this today, this statement is important. All legitimate work is holy. Now, if I were with you in person, we'd all read it together. All legitimate work is holy. The second thing is God calls us to our work. And as I describe tomorrow as I talk on calling, if someone says, well, Jerry, where is your calling? And I said, well, it's to the United States Air Force. What? Not to the navigators? Well, I was first called to the Air Force, and I still have an extensive ministry amongst my friends in the Air Force. So God called me to my work as an astrodynamicist. How do you like that, Chris? Astronautics, astrodynamicist, all of that sort of thing. And by the way, that is just simply the science and mathematics of putting out satellites around the Earth and traveling to the moon and all the mathematics that relate to going from one planet to another, or having the satellites through which this seminar is being broadcast. This goes through several satellites. It probably goes to China and India and down into South America, then a computer in the United States, and then another computer in Kenya. I mean, it's probably gone, every word that we say flies all over the world through the connection of the internet. So these two things, all legitimate work is holy, and God calls us to our work. But now, what are the practical reasons? Those are somewhat theological, theoretical reasons. The practical reasons, we have to put bread on the table. I don't know whether any of you have ever been in a situation in your family where you did not know where the next meal was going to come from. And perhaps you have, but we have to feed our family. The second thing is to use our gifts and our skills. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I hope that Victor sent out an outline, and if he did, I hope he printed it out to take some notes. We'll find out later if that actually came to pass and you were able to do it, because I'd love some feedback on this. The third thing is we want to contribute to society. Let's suppose that you need to go buy some vegetables. Okay, where do? You go down to the market and you go in, and miraculously, there on a table are some vegetables. How did they get there? Well, some farmer had to raise them, someone had to transport them, someone had to distribute them to the various villages and the markets that were going on in your city. And then finally, then someone has to sell them, someone has to make a profit from them, then you come and you buy them and you take them home to consume. That is contributing to society. That's the cooperation of a village. Now, in the simpler rural village setting, it was very obvious. Everybody had to do all kinds of things to make the society work. It's a little less apparent when we've got a computer that we have to buy, and those chips in that computer are made in China or wherever they may be made. The metal that's on the outside or the plastic that's there was manufactured somewhere else. And all of those pieces came together, and then somebody had to manufacture them and make them available to you. And you look at the supply chain for that happening, and it involves thousands of people, all to contribute to society. And sometimes you may say, well, I don't really see how my working in this factory contributes to society. Yes, it does. It gives people work. It gives people relationships. It helps sustain the economy. It helps keep peace. And it helps us not be rebellious to try and take over from the government. So to contribute to society, and then finally, that work ultimately is a calling. So this is the why work. And I hope we get this ourselves. Now, the final thing on that is we are to be salt and light in society. So we not only work to meet our needs, but we work in the midst of others so that we can be salt and light in that society. In Matthew 5:13 through 16, it says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." The genius of work in a society is that everybody sees what you do. And they see the way you work, they see why you work, they see if you're honest, and they see whether they can trust you, whether they can depend upon you. And through that, they will see your good deeds and saying, "Where'd that come from?" And you say, "Ah, I'm glad you asked. It came from my Father in heaven. Let me tell you about him." So we are the presence of Jesus in the midst of an evil world. And I'm going to tell a couple stories here and give you a little of my personal testimony. In the early days of the American space program, I was a young lieutenant. On the picture on the left, I'm that not thin guy with a crew cut, talking with some folks at Cape Canaveral and Central Control, and where I worked with many, many missile launches. It was exciting. It was a time where I worked often through the day and through the night, and sometimes neglecting my family. And it was exciting. I was in a new field. I really did not know what I was doing. And in this time, it was through the Mercury and the Gemini flights. Now, the senior controller, see, I was just a young lieutenant. I was 23 years old there where you see me. But I worked on many other flights besides the manned ones. And up to that point, I had intended to leave the Air Force and go back to work for Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle, where I'd had a job before. But while I was at the Cape, God very clearly spoke to me, and I'm going to tell you about this tomorrow, and said I was to stay in the Air Force, get a master's degree, and then go teach at the Air Force Academy. And we saw how God wanted us to be a witness in my profession. And by the way, don't think that I was such a big deal. I was just a tiny little cog in a huge enterprise. Recently, I've been listening to on a book by tape called Apollo on the entire story of the Apollo program getting man to the moon. And thousands upon tens of thousands of people were involved in that. And the key people who worked night and day for about 7 years to make that happen, out of it were 78 divorces. But also came many, many people who said, I couldn't have done this without the support of my wife. But the fact is, everybody in that program was absolutely, fully intent on making that happen to put man on the moon by the end of the decade of the 60s. So it was fulfilling to just be a small part, but only a very small part. On the right, you'll see a picture of me with a Gemini capsule teaching 2 students. The student in the middle is an interesting man. His name is Butch Zent. Butch was one of my key men. I met man to man with him. And by the way, All the formulas on the board behind that are real. Those are ones that I was teaching. Butch, when he left the academy, and whoops, your speaker is not working. It says, okay, there we come back. Okay. Did we just lose our screen? Let's see here. Hold on. Let me try and get this back. There we are. Well, now, sorry about this. I'm going to come back. Okay, there we are. Have to have a little experience. Nothing ever works perfectly, by the way, so just bear with us. Butch left the academy and he went off into the Air Force, became a fighter pilot. And I remember he came back about a year later and I asked, Butch, how are you doing? He says, well, not too well. He said, I've just gone the way of the fighter pilot. In other words, he was living a wild life. And he went away and I did not hear from him again for 18 years. I wrote him, I wrote his parents, tried to keep touch with him, and never heard a thing. One day, on a Christmas card, he wrote me and says, Jerry, I've just come back to the Lord. I've married a girl from Thailand who does not know the Lord. Pray for her. And my son is in prison. Please pray for me. Well, Butch got back going, is today walking with God and serving him. But he went off for almost 20 years. He retired as an Air Force colonel, had a wonderful career. He now teaches school down in Tampa, Florida. But the reason I put this is I know Butch through his having been a student formed with me at the Air Force Academy and in the Navigator ministry. He didn't do well when he left, but God kept pushing him and kept helping him. Now, that's work, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Now, I couldn't go without talking about handball. Handball is a sport that I play. I played yesterday, and incidentally, my grandson, my son-in-law, that's a handball court. It looks a lot like a squash court. The man up front in the handball court is Vic DeLuzio. The man behind, who may be covered, you can just see his foot right there, Ed Grossenbacher, and I played him, and I beat him in the World Championships, and then he beat me the next year. Vic DeLuzio, who's pictured below, is the Australian champion. He's won all kinds of championships around the world. Here's a picture of Vic and me. I have supposedly, I say supposedly, led Vic to Christ. And Vic, I had some people in Australia trying to follow him up, and he struggles. He's not what we would call your typical navigator. He comes out of a Catholic background, but I remain friends with Vic. He's my friend, and I keep touch with him. I follow him on Facebook. We talk. I see him at tournaments that we play, and so forth. So God has greatly blessed us. So these are the natural context of work and of life, and God has used them, and it caused me to be convinced. And this is, we're not moving forward here somehow, folks. Let me see what's happening. I need to get the next slide. Let me just go down here and I can get to the next slide some way or another. Let me bring that up in case it doesn't come up. I would like to emphasize, and this is the last thing I want you to remember, there is no higher calling. It's not a higher calling to be a navigator, to be a pastor, to be a missionary, than being an engineer or a farmer or whatever other secular profession you have. God has called you to a higher calling. if there is a higher calling, it's to walk with Jesus. And so tomorrow, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through how to develop your own personal calling. And so this says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, working for the Lord, not for men. Or in the Living Bible, it says, work hard and cheerfully at all you do for the Lord, and not merely for your masters. And so I've shared a number of personal illustrations of how that has worked out for me. I'd like to read a couple of quotes. First of all, Kenneth Latourette wrote a series of volumes called The History of the Expansion of Christianity. And he concluded that one of the primary reasons for Christianity's success in the first 3 centuries was that the ministry was taken to the common people, who in turn became the primary means of propagating the gospel. Here's what he says. The chief agents of the expansion of Christianity appear not to have been those who made it a profession or a major part of their occupation, but men and women who earned their livelihood in some purely secular manner and spoke of their faith to others whom they met in the natural fashion, workers in coal, leather, fullers, uneducated people. And so this is how Christianity has moved through the years. And though it doesn't relate as directly here, I want to give an illustration. There was a man by the name of Bob Moore, and he was invited to hear an important speaker address the student body of a small college in South Carolina. And on that day, he said, I went to the auditorium, found it filled with students excited about the opportunity to hear a person of very exalted status speak. And this was an African-American woman by the name of Azzie Taylor Morton, who was at that time Secretary of Treasury of the United States. And after the governor of the state gave the introduction, the speaker, Mrs. Morton, moved to the microphone, looked at the audience from left to right, and began with these words. I was born to a mother who is deaf and could not speak. I do not know who her father is or was. The first job I ever had was in a cotton field picking cotton. And then with a beautiful smile, she said, and I stand before you today as the treasurer of the United States of America. The audience was spellbound. And she said this, nothing has to remain the way it is if that's not the way a person wants it to be. It isn't luck, and it isn't circumstances, and it isn't being born a certain way that causes a person's future to become what it becomes. And she softly repeated, nothing has to remain the way it is if that's not the way a person wants to be. All a person has to do, she said in a firm voice, is to change a situation that brings unhappiness or dissatisfaction. Says, how do I want this situation to become? Then the person must commit totally to personal actions that carry them there. I am aware of this. You may be thinking, I understand. Yet isn't it amazing when work dissatisfaction or unhappiness appears, how few people ask themselves the question, how do I want it to become and what personal actions will carry me there? Now, the reason I included that illustration was we're having race riots in the United States. There's a great deal of conflict over the issue of the opportunities that people have. Here was an example of a woman who had nothing. And by the way, she was turned down for her master's degree at the University of Texas because they said she didn't have the proper prerequisites. So she went to enroll for the prerequisites. And basically, because she was African American, she was Black, they didn't let her in. This is back in the early days of racism in the United States. But what I see in it is that here's Jerry White, comes from this tiny little town in Iowa. I come from a very poor family, and we never lacked food, but I still was a poor family. And God miraculously helped me come to faith, gave me a mentor by the name of Bob Shepler, a businessman, who guided me to the University of Washington, where I met the navigators, allowed me to join the United States Air Force and get a degree in electrical engineering and go on to become an engineer. So there was the opportunity. And all of us have certain opportunities. And we need to see that these opportunities are from God. So thank you for listening today. I hope it's worked for you. I don't know whether you've been able to see my face or not, but in any case, I'm going to cut this off now, and we'll open it up for questions or however our MC wants to conduct us. Blessings on you for today.
Thank you so much, Jerry. It was a very intense, it was brief, but it was intense, and it was very meaningful. And one of the things that stood out for me that you were wishing we could all say out loud together is that all legitimate work is holy. Now, we in Kenya need to really emphasize on the legitimate part. And then there's also something else. The words in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, do it with all your heart. How many times do we wake up and the thought of going to work is just, it makes you depressed? If that's where you're at, then you need to re-examine your position, your current position, because you need to enjoy what you do. You need to do it as unto the Lord, not as unto men. If you are not in that position yet, then perhaps you need to rethink where you're at currently. I will hand this over to Victor for the Q&A. We will handle Q&A. Jerry is going to field questions until 4:10 local time, after which we shall proceed to the break rooms. Victor, are you there?
Yes, I'm there, Denya.
And Victor, be sure I can see the questions. They come up. Somehow I'm not. I just have the last slide.
Okay.
I can see the questions if you can help get that up on the screen.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we are listening in well. I'd prompted us earlier on the chat section to be put up any of the questions that you might be having concerning the whole topic of work and the so I was looking through this chat section. I don't know if anyone has managed to put their questions. The reason we are asking you to put the questions on the chat that it's easier to convey the questions by speak them out because there are the limitations of technology and accent and such things. So, question, a question that's on the chat right now is that what is the definition of legitimate work? From Billy Oyugi, what is what makes work legitimate? Another question similar to that. There are 3 questions, yeah, on the same. If Jerry, you could respond to that.
Yes, I assume can you hear me okay, Victor?
Yes, sir, yeah.
Good. Okay, that's a good question. And I hoped someone would catch the word legitimate, because as you go through the Old Testament, there was work that was not legitimate. Being a prostitute, being one who lent money at an exorbitant rate of interest. I would say in today's world, being in anything that causes harm to society. And really, one has to say, does my work contribute to society? And so with all the things of child pornography and pornography that's out there, you wouldn't want to be in an industry that did that. Now, where does the boundary? You create software that can be used all kinds of places. So there is illegitimate work. I'd say 98%, or I don't know what the number is, but a large percent of work is legitimate. That is, it helps the society. It contributes to your family. It contributes to your community. But that's a good question. But there is work that is done dishonestly, that is done with incredible immoral impact on our society. And I think we ought not to be involved in that. Thank you.
Jerry, there's another question for you on the chat, directly addressed to you. What's your understanding of the biblical meaning of full-time ministry?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because when I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, when I was working in the space program, I was in full-time ministry, because all of my life is a ministry. Now, I make a distinction on what I call vocational Christian work. And that is where my vocation is as a pastor, a missionary, a navigator. So there is such a thing, and it's very legitimate. You know, in the Old Testament, they set aside the Levites to take care of the temple and the tabernacle. In the New Testament, Paul says, even though in the passage that I quoted in 2 Thessalonians, even though Paul said, I did not work, and I worked so that I would not be a burden, he says, not that I don't have the right to it. In other words, he had the right to receive funds from that church. And in fact, when he was ministering in one place, often churches from Ephesus and others would support his needs. And then if that wasn't enough, he would go to work in his profession as a tent maker. So God calls us to be apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and so forth. What it doesn't say in that Ephesians passage is how much of our time is given to that. It may be our full time. We need people who are pastors. We need people who are navigator staff. We need people who will pick up their family and move to another country. Now, when they get there, they may or may not be in the context of their work, because today, with visa situations as they are, many people need to go to other countries in the context of their profession. But that's not necessary. There's another huge issue, and we can talk about this a bit tomorrow if we wish, and that's the issue of capacity. Not everybody can hold a full-time, demanding job, have 5 kids in their family, and have the ability to conduct 25 Bible studies during the week. Now, that's an exaggeration, I realize. But they really don't have the full time. We need some shepherds. We need people who train us. Just like let's just take a teacher as an example. Okay, we need teachers out in the school, but you also need someone who trains at the university. Do you see what I mean? So you have to have the trainers and the shepherds to do that. And so that in itself is a vocation. But what we must not allow ourselves to think is, well, I'm just doing work and writing software. And that's not as important as being a navigator or a pastor. That's an untruth. That's a lie of Satan. It is just as important. It's a matter of where we invest our time.
What I hear you, Jerry, say is that God calls us to work in different contexts, and that just because we are in one context, we shouldn't view that context as holier than the other or less holier than the other. So I think that all work, as you rightly said, is a holy calling.
Right.
Yeah.
So for myself, for the first, 14 years of my career, my calling was inside the Air Force. But I was also working with the navigators. And then God caused me to switch roles to put more time with the navigators, so to speak, full time. But I also did part-time still with the Air Force. And so today, for instance, like last Saturday, a week ago yesterday, I spent most of the day with Air Force Association Matters and still work in that context. Not for any money, I'm doing it as a volunteer. But my primary role now is ministry and teaching.
All right. I would like to request now everyone that the questions are good and they are stimulating, and I'm sure we are enjoying the discussion. But I would like to ask that we transition to the breakout rooms now. Would really like you guys to process with other participants just what you've heard today in today's teaching, and then we'll come back for the wrap-up. I'll put up some questions, some 4 questions for us on the screen just in a moment.